Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of The Package Tourist, hosted by yours truly, the Package Tourist and the magical mystery tour called Life, Matthew DiBiase. Tonight's guest is author Jeffery Payne. Jeffrey presently lives in Virginia, and when he is not indulging his love for football history, he works as a software executive. Jeff Payne has also amassed for over the past 15 years an amazing collection of vintage football items. He is also a contributing editor for Gridiron Greats Magazine and is a host of the Gridiron Greats podcast. Tonight, we will be discussing Jeffrey's first book, which he co-authored with Darin Hayes, Marooned, The Rise, the Fall, and the Redemption of the NFL's Pottsville Maroons, which was released last April. Jeffrey, welcome to the Jeff, welcome to the show. It's a great honor and privilege to have you here. I'd like to start off by asking you, what led you to work with Darin Hayes to write about the Pottsville Maroons?
That's a great question, Matt. Appreciate being on the show. So I first heard about the Maroons about 15 years ago. And the crazy thing was I'd grown up in Pennsylvania, and Pottsville is in Pennsylvania, and I'd read a lot about football growing up. It was my favorite sport to follow and read about. And I had never heard of the Maroons. It was fascinating to me that there were NFL teams in Pennsylvania before the Steelers and Eagles. There was actually two of them, including Pottsville. And I just found that so exciting and interesting, being from PA. And once I learned a little bit more about the Maroons and their compelling NFL story, which we'll get into, I started collecting some memorabilia about the team, blogging about the team, and because this is the 100th anniversary of their first season in the NFL, and when some believe they were the NFL championship that season was stolen from them, Darin and I thought it would be a great time to write a book about the history of football in Pottsville and specifically the whole saga around the Pottsville Maroons. So that's kind of how it came about.
Okay. Who was the team owner or owners, and where did the Maroons play their games, Jeff?
Yeah, so the Maroons owner was a gentleman by the name of John Doc Striegel. He was a local doctor. He had grown up in Pottsville. He'd gone to Pottsville High School. He played football in Pottsville. Then he went to U of Penn, where he played football briefly, but he got injured, decided to retire from the sport, but got his medical degree at University of Pennsylvania and then came back to Pottsville and set himself up as the local doctor. He actually got involved in the team a few years earlier, was involved in the team first as a doctor, then he was part owner, and then in 1924, he took over as the sole owner of the team. And that's when he renamed them the Maroons. Before that, they had a bunch of different names. The team's lineage really dates back to 1919, when a team of servicemen coming out of World War I created a team called the All-Service Team in Pottsville. They had played together in World War I. There was lots of football teams in World War I, and most of these players had played at Pottsville High School, in the teams, and they stuck together after the war. They played together. That team kind of morphed and changed for a few years before it became the Maroons.
Okay, why were they called the Maroons? How did that come about, Jeff?
Yeah, so there was a local sports store owner in Pottsville named Joe Zacco, and he's one of the people actually depicted on the front of our book because he was instrumental to the Maroons, both when they played in the league and then later when they were trying to convince the NFL to give them back the 1925 championship. Doc Striegel came to him in 1924, actually right before their first game, and he said, "Oh my gosh, Joe, I totally forgot uniforms. We don't have any uniforms. Do you think you can track some uniforms down for us?" And Joe Zacco said, "Well, I don't have any in stock, but I can call a couple people who provide equipment and see what's available." And Doc Striegel said, "Well, gosh, our first game is like in 2 days. I don't know if that's possible." And Joe Zacco said, "Well, usually it takes a couple of weeks, but tell you what I'll do. I'll make some calls, and I'll see if we can get something expressed overnight, sent on a train up here to Pottsville. If I can find anything for you, do you care what color they are?" Doc Striegel said at this point, we just need uniforms. We don't want to look like a ragtag bunch. Whatever color is fine. And so Joe Zacco made a few calls. He did track down a distributor that had some uniforms, and they were maroon colored. He convinced this distributor to overnight them to Pottsville. They came the next day, gave them to Doc Striegel. He was so appreciative that he said, you know what, I'm just going to call the team the Pottsville Maroons, since we're wearing maroon uniforms, and that's where the name came from.
Where did the Maroons play their games? Where was the playing field located in the town?
Yeah, it was actually outside of Pottsville in a town right near Pottsville called Minersville, PA.
Yeah.
There was a stadium there. Earlier teams in the Pottsville area had played at a stadium not too far from there as well. Today there's a strip mall there, but they do have a marker that commemorates the Maroons along the highway right there, which I've seen pictures of, and actually going to visit here in a couple of weeks because they're having a big celebration up there, and I'm headed up for the banquet and to speak at that banquet, and I'm going to check out the marker and try to envision what maybe it looked like when there was a football stadium there.
How much public support did Pottsville give the team?
Well, not enough. In summary, not enough to sustain an NFL team, certainly. I mean, lots of very, passionate football fans in Pottsville. But Pottsville's a small town. It was also a coal region town. The town's industry was wrapped around the coal mines in that area. And, if you read about the coal industry and what was going on in the 20s and 30s, it was not a good time. There were lots of strikes and lots of challenges and issues, and because of that, the Maroons had lots of financial troubles. The boosters in Pottsville had the right idea. They actually tried several times to get the town to raise funds and take over the team, kind of like Green Bay did, right? I mean, Green Bay Packers are owned by the town. Pottsville had the same idea. And in fact, the president of the NFL, Curly Lambeau from the Green Bay Packers, both visited Pottsville several times to try to encourage the town business owners and others to raise funds and put a team in place that was owned by the town, because they just knew there was nobody in town that had the capital, individually to, support a team for the long haul in the NFL. And if they had been able to pull it off, we might be talking about them as the Green Bay Packers of the East today. But unfortunately, not meant to be. And Pottsville is, Green Bay is not a huge town, but Pottsville is even smaller.
Yeah.
So they had a pretty tough climb to financially support that team in the long term.
Okay. Who was the head coach of the Maroons?
Yeah, so the head coach was a fellow by the name of Dick Rock. Dick Rock was a player at Penn State, and he had played under a very famous Penn State coach prior to Joe Paterno, and was an assistant there for a bit. He then became an assistant at Colgate. That's where the owner of the Maroons first met Dick Rock, and he convinced Rock to play as a player initially. He played a little bit in 23 and 24, a lot of times under an assumed name. That was pretty common back then, for either college players or coaches who didn't want to be associated with professional football. Of course, back then, professional football wasn't what it is today. It was, in some places, not considered a good thing if you were playing pro football. And so he played under an assumed name. But one thing that impressed Doc Striegel was that the team captain on the 1924 Pottsville Maroons team, this is before they joined the NFL, they were playing in a local coal region league that was established. He told Doc Striegel that whenever he had a question on strategy or approach to something going on in the game, he would turn to Dick Rock. And that stuck in Doc Striegel's mind. And so when there was an opportunity and they needed a coach for the 25 season, and he approached Dick about becoming that coach and taking over as full-time coach. And that meant he transitioned from player coach to, or from player to coach. although he did play in a couple games in a pinch. The rosters were small.
Yeah.
Only had 16 or 17 players at that point. So if he had a few injuries, somebody might need to jump in, and he did jump in and play in a couple games, at least a few times during the 25 season.
Okay, who were the key players for the Maroons? Who scored offensively or whatever? Who were the key players?
Yeah, they had a lot of firepower, and probably the best two players on the team. The first was their end, so wide receiver Charlie Berry. Charlie Berry, just in the book, I call him the All-American boy, because if you look at his career, starting in high school, just wherever he went, he was a superstar, right? In all sports. I mean, he was clearly an all-around athlete. He was a first-team All-American in football at Lafayette, which isn't that far from Pottsville. And he was a first-team All-Pro in the only two NFL seasons he played pro football, in 25 when he was a rookie and 26. And then he transitioned and played in the major leagues. He was a catcher in the major league for 10-plus years. And then he transitioned to be a well-respected umpire in Major League Baseball and a head linesman in the NFL. And he did that for 20 more years.
Wow.
And he is known as the only person to umpire the World Series and referee the NFL championship game in the same season. and just to pile on, he also refereed the college All-Star game that season. Of course, that game is no longer played.
Yeah.
That was a game that was against the college All-Stars versus the Super Bowl champs. And so that record's never going to be matched, I guess is the best way to describe it. I would say that if Charlie Berry had decided to play longer in the NFL, I'm pretty sure he would have been in the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Wow.
He was that talented. Okay. And the other guy that sticks out is a halfback named Tony Latone. And I personally believe that Tony Latone should be in the Hall of Fame. He only played 5 seasons in the NFL, but informal records that were kept. Of course, the NFL didn't start keeping formal stats until the early to mid-30s. So they're all informal records based on newspaper articles and things. But evidence says that he led the NFL in rushing in the 1920s. He only played 5 seasons. And he led the NFL in interceptions on defense in the 1920s. How somebody like that is not in the Hall of Fame, I don't understand.
Okay.
And before the Maroons, he played 10 seasons of independent pro football in the Eastern PA region for a variety of independent pro teams. And everywhere he played, he got accolades for being the superstar. And he made All-Pro a couple years in the 5 years he played in the NFL as well.
Wow.
And he was a star of that team for sure.
Okay. Jeff, what sources did you and Darin use to research this book? And when you were doing the researching and writing, did you and Darin contact any descendants of the Maroons players?
Yeah, we did a lot of research. If you look in the book, there's a zillion references. It's the best way to describe it. We definitely did a lot of review of newspaper accounts, starting in the 1800s where the book starts and talks about football in the early days of Pottsville, all the way up through the 2000s, as they have, worked, tried to get back their 1925 championship. Also, I was fortunate enough, over a decade ago, to pick up several archives of information from people that were affiliated with the Maroons teams in the teens and the 20s. And that archive was just a treasure trove of insights and information about what was going on during that period of time. And then also, I mentioned Joe Zacco, the sports store owner. He led the charge in the 60s and 70s to get the Maroons 25 championship reinstated. And I have all of his correspondence with the NFL, correspondence with the players, correspondence with the owners. That was all. It all came up in auction over a decade ago. And I was just like, this stuff is too historical to let, disappear or get, picked through and destroyed. So I acquired all that stuff and used it as part of the research. I did not talk to any of the players' descendants, but I did have a chance to speak to a number of descendants of Joe Zacco, the sports store owner, including he actually has a son still alive, which is crazy. And what was also crazy, he's only lived 30 miles from me. And he's 95. He's a practicing dentist still today, 95 years old. Spent quite a bit of time with him. He is a joy to talk to about his father. And then I actually got to him through his granddaughter and grandson, who I was able to track down on Facebook. And they gave me lots of information about their grandfather and about the Maroons and whatnot. And that kind of helped us fill in some holes around, what happened and just kind of how it all evolved over time. So.
Okay. Let's talk about that beautiful 1925 season. Pottsville. Who was Pottsville's main competition for the NFL title that year in 1925? Who were they taking on?
Yeah, so going into December, the team with the best record in the NFL was the Chicago Cardinals. Of course, now they're the Arizona Cardinals. They went from Chicago to St. Louis to Phoenix to Arizona. So they're on like their fourth quote city, if you will. But they had the best record in the NFL by a half a game over the Maroons going into December. Now, in the 20s, things were different in the NFL. There was no NFL playoffs. There was no NFL championship. The way it worked, and there was no fixed schedule either. Every owner was responsible for, contacting other owners and creating their own schedule. And then there was an end date for the season, and you can play up until that end date. But a lot of teams didn't totally fix their schedule. They would, set up some games through maybe November, and then they would kind of see how they stood, right? Are we making money? Are we losing money? Should we play another game? Is there some compelling team that maybe we could make some money by playing? It was very focused on how do we make money, as you would imagine back then, because it was tough. And so going into December, the Maroons were a half a game behind the Cardinals, and they actually traveled out to Chicago to play the Cardinals, and they beat the Cardinals.
Wow!
And 21-7 in what a lot of the big cities considered a major upset because Pottsville being a small town in Pennsylvania, they didn't get a lot of respect from a lot of the big cities who just felt like the big city teams were much better. But Pottsville had a heck of a team, and they beat them, and so they had the best record in the league with just a couple of weeks left in the season. And, clearly, I think they had one game left in their season that was scheduled. The Cardinals had none left, but the Cardinals quickly scheduled some additional games, and I'm sure the Pottsville Maroons would have done the same thing to keep their better winning percentage. But unfortunately, as we're going to talk, Pottsville ran into a little bit of a snag with the NFL after that, and unfortunately, because of that, we're not awarded the NFL championship.
Okay, that leads to the next question. Okay, what happened to cause Pottsville to be stripped of the NFL title? And I like to add, was it a just cause to be stripped of the title, or was there chicanery involved?
Yeah, that is such a loaded question that nobody has a perfect answer to. When we started on the book, I had done enough research on the Maroons that I was pretty certain that when all the facts were laid out, I was going to come down on the side of Pottsville on this argument. My co-author, Darin, knew a lot less about the Maroons, and he said right up front, he goes, look, I hope this is okay, but I might come to the conclusion that Pottsville doesn't deserve the NFL championship. And I said, hey, that might actually make a more interesting book. We could have a point counterpoint at the end. So, you got to go with what you hear and you read. And I'm going to do the same thing, because obviously if we dig into this and we find out that, yes, indeed, the NFL, made the right call, then I think we need to follow the facts. And so, our whole research was to drill into this and sort through it. It's a complicated story, and figure out what the facts were, and then render kind of an opinion. In the end, we both came down on the side of Pottsville, and just kind of Cliff Notes version of what happened is Doc Striegel, owner of the Maroons, was contacted by a promoter who wanted to set up an exhibition game that the Maroons would play in. This was pretty common back then.
Yeah.
You know, if you're familiar with Red Grange and the barnstorming tour that he did after that season, it was very common for NFL teams. Again, they're trying to make money. If there was an opportunity to play a non-NFL team or an all-star team or anything that you could hype up and market as a great game and attract fans and make some cash, teams were doing it, right? So a promoter from Philadelphia contacted the Maroons and offered them the opportunity to play an exhibition game in Philly. And it was going to be against an all-star team that he was putting together that was comprised mostly of the 1924 Notre Dame college team. They'd all graduated.
Yeah.
That had won the college championship that season. So he was kind of positioning it as, look, this is the best team from college from the year before versus at least one of the best teams. This was before the Maroons had beat the Cardinals, so they didn't yet have the best record, but they had one of the best records. You know, to pit the college, team, a good college team against a really good NFL team, that had never been done before. And, there was a lot of intrigue there because lots of people believed that the college teams were still stronger than the pro teams at that point, and this was going to be an opportunity for them, to play each other. Well, this was intriguing to Doc Striegel. He thought this one could make the Maroons some money, and they desperately needed money. And so he was interested in this, but he told the promoter, he said, look, I know I have to call the NFL. I have to get permission to play this game because, during the regular season and the date at which this promoter had secured Shibe Park in Philly, which is where this game would be held, was still during the NFL season, and Doc Striegel knew the rule was you had to call and get permission to play. He also knew there was kind of an unwritten rule that you didn't play games in other teams' territory. Like you weren't supposed to go into their area where their team was based and play a game unless you got permission to play that game. And there was a team in Philly, the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets. Frankfurt is a suburb of Philly.
Yeah.
It was another NFL team. And Doc Striegel knew, I got to call the NFL and get permission. He told the promoter, if I don't get permission, I'm not going to sign a contract. So Doc Striegel called the NFL. The problem was NFL president, that's what they called the commissioner then, Joe Carr, was not in the office. He was sick. He'd had emergency appendicitis, and he'd been in the hospital, and he was still recovering. And he had someone answering the phone for him in the NFL office. Of course, this was before voicemail, call forwarding. It would just ring. Somebody was there to answer it. He had a friend, Jerry Corcoran, who was an owner of another team in the NFL, Columbus Panhandles. And this was a team that Joe Carr had been affiliated with before he took over as NFL president. He asked Jerry Corcoran to answer the phone in the NFL office and field calls and deal with them. So that's what Jerry Corcoran was doing. Doc Striegel called up. He said, hey, we got this chance to play this game. It's against the Notre Dame. They were calling them the Notre Dame All-Stars at that point. They'd all graduated. They were now pros. It's in Philly. I checked the Frankfurt schedule. They don't have any games scheduled. I don't think they're going to have a problem with this game. What do you think about us playing this game? So Corcoran said, sounds great. I don't see any reason you can't play this game. Good luck. I hope you win. This sounds like a great thing for the NFL. So Doc Striegel gets off the phone, and he says, hey, I got permission from the NFL, right? They said it's fine to play. So the next day he signs a contract with the promoter to play this game. A few weeks later, the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets get wind that this game's going to happen, and this is probably 4 or 5 days before the game's actually going to occur. So now we're right up against, the game is being promoted at this point. The Maroons, they've signed a contract at this point. The Notre Dame All-Stars are getting ready to travel to Philly. Everything is set. Frankfurt Yellow Jackets call the NFL, and they protest. Joe Carr, the president of the NFL, is back in the office now. He fields the call. And he's like, yeah, you're right. Pottsville shouldn't be playing in Philly. This is still during the season. They don't have permission to do that. Nobody knows for sure if Joe Carr had talked to Jerry Corcoran, if he hadn't, if Jerry Corcoran realized he'd made a mistake, never should have approved this. But for whatever reason, this is where it was at. So Joe Carr calls Doc Striegel, and he says, you're not allowed to play this game. If you play this game, we're going to suspend you from the league, and we're going to take your franchise. Doc Striegel says, well, this isn't fair. I called, I got permission, I signed a contract. I'm now I'm legally bound to play this game. Will the NFL foot the bill when I get sued? Because if I back out of this contract, I'm going to get sued, and we can't afford that in Pottsville. And Joe Carr says, well, we'll help you as much as we can, but I can't guarantee you we can cover all your losses. Doc Striegel happens to be his brother was a lawyer, takes this to his lawyer, his brother. They look at the NFL Constitution, they look at the bylaws, and his brother says they don't have any legal right to kick us out of the league. There is nothing in here written about territorial rights. There is no defined penalty clauses in here. There's no definition of an appeal process. There's nothing in this Constitution legally that says the NFL can stop us from playing this game. So Doc Striegel and his brother think, well, what's it going to be? Do we not play this game and we get sued and it costs us we don't know how much money? Or do we play this game and then fight with the NFL after it for them to understand that, hey, it wasn't our fault. You all gave us permission to play the game, and we signed that contract based on the call that we made to the NFL. And so they played the game. And Joe Carr suspended them from the league at the end. Now, there's a lot more to the story because they actually ended up getting back in the league, and it's very unclear why, in the end, they weren't reinstated as the champs, but that's kind of what transpired.
Okay. Now, what led? Moving on now, what led to the Maroons leaving Pottsville and moving to Boston? What happened there?
Well, Doc Striegel had sunk an incredible amount of his own money into this team. I mean, he got involved, as I mentioned, in a little bit in 22 as the doctor, and then 23 as a part owner, 24 as the owner, and then he was the owner through 1928. But he was constantly trying to get the team to take over the team. He didn't want to be the owner of this team. He was doing this for Pottsville. He wanted the team to have, he wanted the town to have an NFL team. He wanted to help lead it, but he wanted the team to take over financial responsibility. And as I mentioned, they just didn't have the ability to do that. And because of that, they were in constant financial straits. And finally, after the 28 season, he just threw his hands up and said, you know what, I just can't keep sinking funds into this team. And since the town doesn't seem to have the financial capability to run the team, I'm going to sell the team. So he sold the team to an investment group that their plan was to move the franchise to Boston, a bigger city that they hoped they could make a go of it. And so that's what they did. They played in Boston for one season, but unfortunately, that was 1929. It's another event that happened that year that everybody remembers, and that was the stock market crashing.
Yep.
And the start of the Great Depression. And the NFL went from at their heyday in the 20s, the NFL had 22 teams in the league, and by the mid-30s, they were at like 7 or 8 teams. They didn't reach 22 teams again until they merged with the AFL at the end of the 60s.
Yeah.
And that was the hit that the NFL took. And the Boston/Pottsville team was one of the teams that didn't make it.
Okay. Jeff, are there any attempts today, right here and now, to convince the NFL to give back the title to Pottsville? I mean, are any present-day movements? If so, who's leading the charge?
Yeah, Yeah, there is a bit of a movement in the last year with the 100th anniversary. There was a huge movement in the 60s and 70s led by Joe Zacco. After he passed in 75, his son Russ took it over. He carried it into the early 2000s, and several times they had votes come up with the NFL. But, you've got a situation where one of the teams in this conflict, the Cardinals, is still in the NFL. One of the teams is not, right? It's this little town, Pottsville. Are owners going to vote against an existing owner for a team that nobody cares about?
Yeah.
Probably not, right? There has been a movement in the last year. A congressman from Pennsylvania has taken up the cause once again, has, tried to generate some noise. Pottsville's trying to generate some noise. We're trying to generate some noise. But I think the closest they probably came was in 1967, maybe 2003. Both of those, they took a serious run, but in the end, the NFL owners had no appetite to do anything. The crazy thing is that, according to the records, no team was voted NFL champions. So the fact that the Cardinals claim they're the champions, there's no record that was ever officially done. What happened was, because of this big, controversy, the owners never voted for an NFL champion in 25, and just for years in the record books, it just was shown as there's no champion. And then at some point, the Cardinals aren't, either arm twisted or convinced the NFL that, hey, you should just consider us the champions. And the NFL kind of acquiesced, even though, there's no evidence that they ever formally voted the Cardinals to be the champs. But today, the Cardinals kind of claim it as their championship.
Okay. Jeffrey, let's talk about yourself. Where were you born and raised?
So I grew up south of Erie, Pennsylvania, so near the Great Lakes in PA.
Okay.
Grew up there, attended Penn State, hashtag we are. But ended up, I was an economics major there, ended up transferring, though, to Allegheny College as I kind of shifted my focus school-wise to computer science and software. Got my bachelor's degree at Allegheny College, which is in Northwest PA. And then I went to grad school right after that at William & Mary here in Virginia. Got my master's in computer science and love the warmer weather down here in Virginia and just never left. So still located in Virginia for 35 years now.
Okay. What led you to start collecting vintage NFL memorabilia?
Yeah, so about 15 years, maybe 17 years or so. I had two boys, young boys. I collected football cards when I was a kid. I still had them, carried them with me all through my life, drug them around with me. And I used to show them to the boys, and they were playing baseball and flag football and soccer and lacrosse and, just all sorts of stuff as kids. Watching sports, reading about sports, and they kind of got interested in collecting cards. And so we started going to flea markets, and we found a little card shop, and they were kind of getting into it. And, I figured it would kind of be fun to, do the hobby with them a little bit. So I started initially just working on completing some of my sets that I still had that I hadn't completed from being a kid in the 70s. But I always loved history, and I always loved the early stuff in football. And just over time, I started shifting, earlier to, earlier football because of my interest in history. And so, today I concentrate mostly on pre-World War II pro football, 1800s college football, so back to the kind of origins of the American football game back in the 1800s. I look for pre-NFL pro stuff, which is hard to find. Collect Jim Thorpe, collect Red Grange, and I collect the beloved Pottsville Maroons. That's kind of my focus these days.
Jeff, whenever I interview an author, I always love to ask the standard question. when you were growing up, who were your favorite authors? And of those favorite authors, did any of them light the spark inside you to become a writer or perhaps influence your writing style?
Yeah, so I did a lot of reading as a kid. I love to read. I still read all the time. I've got so many football books, it's crazy. And I actually read every football book in the elementary, middle school, and high school libraries. Because I just love sports books. That's how I was introduced to Jim Thorpe and Red Grange and all those great players from the past. But my favorite author growing up was Stephen King. So I read probably the first 20 books that Stephen King wrote. I have not probably read anything he's written in the last 15, 20 years, just because with kids and everything else, it kind of gets in the way, and football's been kind of all-consuming. But Stephen King was my favorite go-to author growing up. I love especially his early stuff. So he was my favorite, and I love for football. Somebody I've gotten to know in the hobby and in sports is Chris Willis, who writes really well detailed books on football. He wrote a great book on Joe Carr, Red Grange, other two-way players. He just writes incredibly great football books. He's probably my favorite football book author right now.
Okay. Jeff, do you have a future book project in the works? And if so, when can we expect its release?
Yeah, I've got some ideas in the works. Nothing firm, but I really enjoyed this process. Darin had written 3 football books before, and one of the intriguing things about working with Darin was I was hoping he could kind of shepherd me through the publishing process and explain how it all worked, because I'd never written a book before. And that was so helpful. He was so helpful, and he just knows that process so well. So now I'm feeling like, all right, I could write some more. And I guess my goal is I'd like to write a new football book maybe every year or two. I have some initial ideas on some things. I've got some stuff that maybe it's not in the next year or two, but a little bit further out that's pretty exciting. That I'm pretty excited about, but not ready yet to talk about that yet, because it's still kind of forming. Okay. But I'm hoping to write something in the next year or two. I just have to decide what it's going to be, and we'll see what comes out of it.
Jeff, I want to thank you so much for appearing on the show, and let me know when your next book does come out, and I'd love to have you on the show again, okay?
Awesome, yeah. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
You take care, Jeff.
All right, thanks.
Okay, bye-bye. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for next week's show, where I will be interviewing author Amy Jane Cohen. Thank you and good night.